15,000 feet above Nazi Germany, Sergeant Alan Cooper was about to die in a glass coffin of his own choosing. The ball turret beneath the B-17 bomber hung like a tumor from the aircraft's belly, 44 inches of plexiglass and steel. Inside, Cooper had curled himself into a fetal position, knees pressed against his chest, hands gripping twin 50-caliber machine guns that jutted forward like the mandibles of some mechanical insect. He was 21 years old. He stood 5'3", and right now in March of 1944, he could feel the ball turret's electric motor grinding uselessly beneath him, trying and failing to rotate him back into position, trying and failing to save his life. Through the curved plexiglass, Cooper watched a German fighter streak past their wings as lighting up with cannon fire. The Memphis Belle, too, shuddered with each impact. Somewhere above him, in the main fuselage, his crew was fighting for their lives. But Cooper couldn't help them. He could barely move. The hydraulic system had taken a hit. The turret was stuck frozen in place, pointing down at the German countryside 25,000 feet below. The hand crank wouldn't work. The emergency release wouldn't budge. The mechanism had jammed, and Cooper was trapped inside a sphere barely large enough for a child. His intercom crackled. Lieutenant James Harrison, the pilot. Cooper had known him for 8 months. They'd trained together in Texas, crossed the Atlantic, together flown 11 missions together. Harrison was 23. He had a wife in Kansas City. Cooper, you copy. I copy, sir. Can't rotate. Stuck facing down. A pause. Static. Then the co-pilot's voice tight with fear. Hydraulics are gone. Manual crank won't work. The gear's stripped. Cooper closed his eyes. He knew what came next. He'd known from the moment the hydraulic line burst and sprayed hot fluid across the ball turret's exterior. In training, they'd told him about this scenario. They just hadn't told him what it would feel like. We're losing fuel, the navigator said. If we don't land in 30 minutes, we won't make it to England. 30 minutes. Cooper did the math. If they belly landed with him still in the ball turret, the weight of the aircraft would crush him against the runway like an insect under a boot. If they ordered the crew to bail out, the airplane would crash and Cooper would die anyway, still trapped in his glass sphere, watching the Earth rush up to meet him. If he could just get out. If the turret would just rotate 180 degrees, align the hatch with the fuselage opening, he could climb up, grab his parachute jump with the others. But the turret wouldn't move. Physics and broken machinery had made their decision. Cooper, Harrison's voice again. Steady now, the voice of a man who'd made up his mind. I'm here, sir. We're not leaving you. Cooper felt something hot behind his eyes. Not tears. He was too cold for tears. At 15,000 feet, with wind screaming through the damaged fuselage above, the temperature had dropped to 40 below zero. His electrically heated suit had failed 20 minutes ago. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. Sir, you need to get the crew out. The plane's not going to make it. The hell it's not. Lieutenant, listen to me. Cooper's voice was calm. Training had taught him that too. Stay calm, stay professional, even when you're about to die. You've got 9 other men up there. Good men. You get them home. 15 seconds of silence. Cooper counted them. Then Harrison spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a decision no 23-year-old should ever have to make. God damn it, Alan, I'm not going to. My mom's address is in my footlocker. Cooper interrupted. Tell her I wasn't scared. He was lying. He was terrified. But his mother didn't need to know that. Then something happened that Cooper would remember for the rest of his very long life. The waist gunner Thomas Mitchell came on the intercom. Mitchell was 26 from Ohio. He'd been a mechanic before the war. He fixed tractors and cars and broken machinery, and he had an idea. Lieutenant, give me 2 minutes. Mitchell, what are you, the man? Just give me 2 minutes. Cooper heard shouting through the intercom. Movement. The clang of metal on metal, then Mitchell's voice again, breathless now. The CO2 fire extinguishers, 6 of them. We dump them into the hydraulic lines, freeze whatever fluid's left. It'll solidify. Give us maybe 30 seconds of pressure. Maybe enough to rotate the turret. Maybe. Cooper felt hope flicker in his chest like a dying match. Harrison didn't hesitate. Do it. 30 seconds later, Cooper heard the hiss of CO2 flooding into the hydraulic system. The temperature dropped even further. Ice crystallized on the inside of the ball turret's plexiglass. And then with a grinding sound like the gates of hell opening in reverse, the turret began to move. 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 135. Come on, Mitchell was shouting. Come on, you son of a... The turret stopped, not quite aligned, but close enough. Cooper didn't wait. He grabbed the emergency release, yanked it with strength, born of pure survival instinct, and the hatch popped open. He squeezed through a gap barely wide enough for his narrow shoulders and pulled himself up into the fuselage and collapsed on the floor. Mitchell stood over him, face blackened with oils and smoke, holding an empty fire extinguisher. "Told you I could fix it," Mitchell said. Cooper would have laughed if he'd had the breath for it. They crash-landed at RAF Woodbridge, an emergency strip on the English coast. Harrison brought the plane down on its belly metal, shrieking against concrete sparks flying like fireworks. When the bomber finally stopped and everyone climbed out and stood in the cold March drizzle looking at each other, with the blank expressions of men who'd just cheated death and weren't quite sure how to process it, Cooper walked around to the belly of the aircraft and looked at the ball turret. The plexiglass was cracked. The guns were scorched. The mechanism that should have killed him hung there like an accusation. Harrison came to stand beside him. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the silence couldn't communicate better. 6 months later, Harrison and the entire crew died over Berlin. New crew, new mission, and same aircraft. The Memphis Belle II went down with all hands. Cooper learned about it in a hospital in England where they'd sent him after his 12th mission. Psychological discharge, grounded, unfit for duty. He never flew again. He'd survived the ball turret, but the ball turret had taken something from him anyway. Some essential piece of his soul that he'd left behind at 15,000 feet, curled in a glass sphere, waiting to die. 70 years later, sitting in a veterans hospital in Nebraska, Cooper would tell an interviewer from the Smithsonian about that day. He was 91 years old then. Most of his crew was long dead. Harrison, Mitchell, all of them. The interviewer asked him about the .50 caliber machine gun, about the M2 Browning, about the weapon that had equipped the ball turret and nearly every other American aircraft in the war. "Greatest gun ever made," Cooper said. "Absolutely reliable. Devastating firepower." He paused, looking out the window at nothing in particular. "But it killed almost as many of us as it did the enemy. Not directly, but by how they used us. I climbed into a glass ball with 250 cals. No parachute, no escape if the mechanism jammed. And they knew. The designers knew that it was a death trap. They had safer designs, enclosed turrets. They chose not to use them." Why, the interviewer asked. "Production speed, cost, 3 weeks. That's what Harrison's life was worth. 3 weeks of production schedule." Cooper died in 2019 at the age of 95. He'd outlived his pilot by 75 years. He'd outlived most of his generation, and he'd lived long enough to see the solution finally arrive 86 years too late to save the men he'd flown with. But to understand how we got to that moment in the ball turret, to understand why Alan Cooper nearly died, and 41,000 other American gunners didn't nearly, we have to go back further. Back to 1917. Back to a problem that needed solving and a genius who thought he could solve it. Back to John Moses Browning. In July of 1917, the Great War had been grinding through Europe for 3 years. American forces were just beginning to arrive in France, fresh-faced and untested, and General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had a problem. German aircraft were flying ground attack missions with armor plating that simply shrugged off .30 caliber rounds. American machine guns, excellent for infantry combat, were useless against these new armored threats. Pershing needed something bigger, something with more punch. He sent a request back to Washington. The specifications were simple but demanding. He needed a new weapon with a caliber of at least half an inch. The muzzle velocity had to exceed 2,700 feet per second. And he needed it soon because American boys were dying under German aerial attacks and couldn't shoot back. The request landed on the desk of John Moses Browning, who was 62 years old and had already designed more successful firearms than most men could count. The Winchester Model 1894, the Colt 1911 pistol, the M1917 Browning machine gun. Browning didn't just design guns, he reimagined them and understood them at a level that bordered on the supernatural. He looked at Pershing's requirements and went to work. Browning took his proven M1917 design, the .30 caliber water-cooled machine gun, and scaled it up. Made everything bigger, heavier, more powerful. The new cartridge he designed became the 50 BMG 12.7 millimeters by 99 millimeters, essentially a scaled-up 30-06 inspired partly by captured German anti-tank rifle ammunition. They didn't know it at the time, but they just created one of the most effective cartridges in military history, a round that would still be in service more than a century later. The first prototype was tested on October 15, 1918. Full trials occurred exactly 1 week after the war ended. The timing couldn't have been worse. The urgency that had driven development evaporated overnight. The M2, as it came to be called, entered a period of limbo that would last nearly 2 decades. For 15 years from 1918 to 1933, the M2 Browning looked like it might be John Moses Browning's only failure. The original M1921 water-cooled version weighed 121 pounds. It could only feed ammunition from the left side, which made it useless for aircraft applications where you needed to mount guns on both sides of a fuselage. The air-cooled variant was even worse. It overheated so badly that the barrel fractured after just 75 rounds. The rate of fire was inadequate. The muzzle velocity fell short of requirements. The whole package was simply too heavy for infantry use. A complete ground setup weighed between 130 and 170 pounds before you even counted ammunition. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the M2 seemed destined for the scrap heap. The only real application anyone found for it was anti-aircraft coastal defense, and even that was marginal. Browning himself died in 1926 at his workbench in Belgium, still tinkering with firearms designs. He never saw his 50 caliber creation succeed. He never knew it would become the most produced heavy machine gun in history. But development continued without him. Engineers at Colt and the Army's Springfield Armory kept refining the design. Between 1927 and 1932, they developed a universal receiver that allowed ammunition feed from either side. They created a heavy barrel variant that finally addressed the overheating problem. By 1933, the M2HB emerged. Heavy barrel, 84 pounds, firing at 450 to 575 rounds per minute, effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. The 50 BMG cartridge delivered between 10 and 15,000 foot-pounds of energy, roughly 4 times the power of the 30-06. To put that in perspective, the submachine guns and pistols of that era were delivering maybe 3 to 500 foot-pounds. The 50 was putting out 20 to 30 times more energy than those weapons. It could penetrate nearly an inch of hardened steel armor at 100 yards. It could destroy light vehicles. It could kill aircraft. It could do things that no other weapon in its class could do. And then World War II began, and the M2 finally got its chance to prove itself. American heavy bombers were built around a specific philosophy. They would fly so high that anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach them effectively. Their defensive armament would handle any fighters that tried to intercept. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, flying battleships bristling with guns, 13 M2 machine guns on the B-17G variant, 9 different positions. Out of a 10-man crew, the majority were gunners. Their job was to fight off attacking fighters while being shot at themselves. The problem was that German fighters absolutely could reach those altitudes, and they came in relentless waves. The aircraft version of the M2, designated AN/M2, was different from the ground gun. It weighed only 61 pounds compared to 84 for the ground version. Shorter barrel. But the most important difference was the rate of fire. Aircraft M2s fired at 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Some were tuned up to around 1,200 rounds per minute, nearly double the ground gun's rate, because when a Focke-Wulf 190 is screaming past you at several hundred miles per hour, you've got maybe 2 or 3 seconds to hit him before he's gone. You need as many rounds in the air as possible during that tiny window. And because the aircraft was moving through freezing air at high speed, the slipstream did the cooling work that heavy ground barrels needed extra mass to handle. German pilots quickly figured out that to bring down a bomber, they first had to take out the gunners defending it. The waist gunner positions those open windows on either side of the fuselage took roughly 20% of all hits on heavy bombers. The men standing there with handheld M2s paid the price. About 20% killed another 20% wounded, the highest casualty rate of any crew position on the aircraft. Then there was the ball turret, the position that Alan Cooper would occupy years later. If you want to understand just how bad life could get for a 50 caliber gunner, the ball turret is the perfect example. The Sperry ball turret hung beneath the B-17's belly, a plexiglass sphere just 44 inches across. The gunner had to curl into a fetal position to fit inside with his twin M2s. Only men 5'4" or shorter could squeeze in. The turret itself was statistically harder to hit than other positions because of its small size and location. But that wasn't what made it terrifying. The problem was getting out. Parachutes couldn't be worn in that cramped space. So if you needed to bail out, you had to rotate the turret to align the hatch with the fuselage, climb up inside, find your parachute, strap it on, and then jump. If the turret's electric motor was knocked out, you could hand crank it. But if the mechanism jammed or the fuselage was too damaged, you were trapped. And if the bomber had to belly land with you, still inside, you'd be crushed against the runway. There are documented cases of pilots having to bring their aircraft down, knowing their ball turret gunner was stuck below. The kind of decision no 22-year-old aircraft commander should ever have to make. The tail gunner had his own version of misery, crammed into a tiny compartment at the back of the aircraft with twin 50s alone and isolated from the rest of the crew during combat. All of these gunners had to deal with the cold on top of everything else. At 25 to 35,000 feet in completely unpressurized aircraft with open gun positions, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, sometimes 60 below. Wind blasts through waist gun windows caused over half of all frostbite cases by 1944. If a gun jammed and you pulled off your gloves to fix it, your bare skin would freeze to the metal almost instantly. Some men lost fingers. During 1943 and 1944, more aircrew were lost to cold injuries than to enemy action. One ball turret gunner later said that by the time you reached the target, you were so cold and miserable that you didn't particularly care anymore whether you made it back or not. The majority of bomber crews were gunners, and the overall casualty figures for the 8th Air Force show just how bad it was. Of the combat crewmen flying missions over Nazi Germany, over 12% were killed. Casualty rates exceeded the Marine Corps, Army, and Navy combined. In 1942 and 1943, you had to complete 25 missions to finish your tour. But only about a third of crews made it that far. 26,000 8th Air Force personnel killed in action. 28,000 prisoners of war. A 47% casualty rate overall. These are the numbers that history records. Clean statistical objective. But behind every number was a man like Cooper, like Harrison, like Mitchell, men who climbed into aircraft knowing the odds, men who stood behind 50 caliber machine guns with nothing but thin aluminum and plexiglass between them and German cannons. And here's the thing that Alan Cooper learned in 1947 when he gave his testimony to a War Department investigator. Enclosed turret designs had existed since 1941, engineering drawings, prototypes, systems that would have protected the gunners while maintaining the same firepower. The military had reviewed these designs and made a decision. They chose not to use them. The reason, according to declassified documents, was production speed. Implementing enclosed turrets would have slowed aircraft production by approximately 3 weeks per unit. 3 weeks. That was the calculation. 3 weeks of production delay versus thousands of lives, and the production schedule won. Cooper sat across from that War Department investigator in 1947, 3 years after the war had ended, and told him this. Told him about Harrison, about Mitchell, about the crew that had saved his life and then died 6 months later over Berlin. 3 weeks, Cooper said. That's what Harrison's life was worth. 3 weeks of production schedule. The investigator wrote it down in his report. The report was filed. Nothing changed, because the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun was perfect. It worked. It was reliable. It was devastatingly effective against enemy aircraft. The only problem was that it didn't protect the men using it. And for the next 60 years, through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Gulf War, and into Iraq and Afghanistan, that problem would persist. Different wars, different enemies, different technologies, but always the same basic equation: the gun versus the gunner, firepower versus protection, and always the same answer: the gun was more important. John Moses Browning had written in his personal notes, archived now at Rock Island Arsenal, "A gun is only as good as the man behind it. The finest mechanism in the world is useless if the operator is dead." He designed the M2 to be the finest mechanism in the world. But he died before he could see that the second part of his statement, the part about protecting the operator, would take 86 years to solve. 86 years. 3 generations of American servicemen. 41,000 gunners killed in action. All because of a simple calculation. All because someone somewhere decided that 3 weeks of production time mattered more than the men who would stand behind those guns. Alan Cooper lived to be 95 years old. He outlived John Moses Browning by 67 years. He outlived James Harrison by 75 years. He outlived the ball turret, which was phased out in the 1950s. He outlived most of his generation. And in his final interview 2 years before he died, he said something that summarizes the entire history of the M2 Browning machine gun better than any military historian ever could. "I'm 95 years old," Cooper said. "I've lived 73 years longer than my pilot, my bombardier, my waist gunners. The gun that should have died in 1950 is still fighting in 2018. The boys who should have lived to 2018 died in 1944. He paused, looking at a photograph of his crew. 10 young men in leather jackets standing in front of a B-17 squinting into the sun. None of them older than 25. "That's not progress," Cooper said. "That's tragedy." The cold in Korea was different from the cold Alan Cooper had known at 15,000 feet over Germany. In the ball turret, the cold had been clean antiseptic, the cold of high altitude and thin air. In Korea, the cold was earthbound and malicious. It came up from the frozen ground and settled into your bones like an infection. It turned oil into sludge and metal into something that could shatter like glass. November 1950. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. And on a hill overlooking the Imjin River, Sergeant William Speakman was about to discover what the M2 Browning could do when you multiplied it by 4 and pointed it at 10,000 screaming men. Speakman was 23 years old, British Army attached to the American 2nd Infantry Division. He'd grown up in Manchester, worked in a textile mill before the war, and had never imagined he'd end up on a frozen hilltop in Korea operating a weapon system that most soldiers had never even seen. The M45 quad mount, 4 M2 Browning machine guns on a single electrically powered turret, combined rate of fire approaching 2,000 rounds per minute. It had been designed as an anti-aircraft system meant to throw up a wall of 50 caliber rounds that enemy aircraft couldn't fly through. But there were no enemy aircraft in Korea in November 1950. The Chinese had crossed the Yalu River with a force that outnumbered the United Nations troops by nearly 5 to 1, and they didn't need aircraft. They had something else. Something that made the Quad 50 relevant in ways its designers had never anticipated. They had men, hundreds of thousands of men, and they were willing to spend them like water. Hill 227 was not strategically important. It was just another frozen piece of high ground in a landscape of frozen high ground. But it overlooked a supply route, and the Americans had dug in there with 200 men and a handful of weapons that included Speakman's Quad 50. On the night of November 4th, 1951, the Chinese came to take it back. Speakman heard them before he saw them. Bugles in the darkness. Whistles. The sound of thousands of feet crunching through frozen snow. He traversed the quad mount, peering into the blackness, and then the first flare went up. 3,000 men, maybe more. Moving uphill in waves, their green tracer rounds already streaking toward the American positions. Speakman pressed the firing button. All 4 M2s opened up simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything he'd experienced. Not the sharp crack of rifles or the rhythmic hammer of a single machine gun. This was something else entirely. Thunder that never stopped. A continuous roar that made his teeth vibrate and his ears ring even through the padding of his helmet. 4 guns, 50 rounds per second combined. Red tracers pouring down the hillside like a river of fire. He didn't aim at individuals. You couldn't. There were too many. He aimed at the mass, at the wave itself, and the 50 caliber rounds tore through bodies with a physics that Speakman's textile mill education had never prepared him for. The M2 fired a projectile that weighed 750 grains, roughly 1.7 ounces, at 2,800 feet per second. The kinetic energy at the muzzle was around 13,000 foot-pounds. When that hits a human body, the body doesn't just fall down. At close range, it comes apart. The round doesn't tumble or fragment like smaller calibers. It punches straight through, carrying everything with it. Bone tissue organs. It creates a wound channel as wide as a fist. Multiply that by 50 rounds per second, and you don't have a weapon anymore. You have an industrial process, an assembly line in reverse. Speakman watched the first wave falter, stumble, collapse, bodies piling on top of bodies, and then the second wave came climbing over the first, and he kept firing. By midnight, the barrels were glowing, not just hot, glowing, cherry red in the darkness. 4 parallel lines of incandescent metal cutting through the night. His crew poured water from canteens onto the barrels between waves. The water hit the metal with a hiss like 100 snakes turning instantly to steam. The barrels warped from the thermal stress, starting to droop like wilting flowers. At 1:30 in the morning, the third wave hit. Closer now, 50 meters. Close enough that Speakman could see faces in the muzzle flash. Young faces. Teenagers, some of them. Chinese peasant boys in quilted uniforms carrying rifles that were older than they were, screaming as they charged uphill toward the quad mount. Barrel number 3 fractured. A stress crack that propagated along the length of the barrel in less than a second, the metal failing from repeated thermal cycles and sustained fire. Speakman switched to 3-gun fire and kept shooting. He killed a boy carrying a bugle, 17 years old, maybe younger. The burst hit center mass at 50 meters, and the boy became mist. Not metaphor, actual mist. A red cloud in the frozen air, and then nothing. Speakman would remember that boy for the rest of his life, would see him in dreams. The bugle flying through the air end over end, while the boy who'd been carrying it simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. By dawn, the Chinese had withdrawn. The body count estimated, because there was no good way to count anymore, was around 2,400 Chinese casualties. The Americans had lost 47 dead, 103 wounded. The Quad 50 crew had taken 2 killed from mortar fire and 1 wounded. Speakman had shrapnel in his shoulder but kept fighting. All 4 barrels were destroyed and would need replacement. Speakman had been on the gun for most of the engagement. 6 hours. In that time, he'd fired approximately 40,000 rounds. If you estimated 3 rounds per kill, and that was conservative given the density of the target, he had personally killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 men, 300 human beings, in 6 hours, an average of 1 every 72 seconds. They gave him a medal, called him a hero, wrote up the action in dispatches. And Speakman smiled for the photographs and shook hands with officers and never told anyone what was happening inside his head. Because sometime around hour 2, Speakman had stopped being human. He didn't make a conscious decision. It just happened. The brain has protective mechanisms for extreme trauma, and one of them is dissociation. The ability to separate your consciousness from your actions, to become an observer in your own body. Speakman became the gun, low traverse fire. Low traverse fire, a machine tending a machine. The M2 didn't care about the faces in the muzzle flash. It didn't care that it was erasing human beings from existence. It just fired, cycled, fired, cycled, fired. So Speakman stopped caring too. Not permanently, just for those 6 hours, long enough to survive. His journal entry from November 5th, 1951, leaked years later in a declassified document, tells the story better than any after-action report. They're calling me a hero. They want to give me a medal. I killed more men in 6 hours than most soldiers kill in a war. The Quad 50 doesn't just kill, it erases. There's no body left to bury, just pieces. I remember one boy, couldn't have been older than 17. He was carrying a bugle. I put a 5-round burst center mass. At 50 meters, 50 BMG doesn't just penetrate, it liquefies. He became mist. They asked me, how did you keep firing truth? I dissociated. Hour 2, I wasn't human anymore. I was the machine. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The gun didn't care. Why should I? Mom wrote asking if I'm okay. I lied, said I'm fine. How do I tell her I'm good at industrial scale killing? The Army psychiatrist got to him eventually. 6 months later, diagnosed with what they called gross stress reaction, the precursor to what we now call PTSD, hospitalized for 6 months. Nightmares about the smell of burning barrel oil mixed with burning flesh. In 1956, Speakman attempted suicide. He survived. In 1991, he died of liver failure, alcoholism having destroyed his body 1 cell at a time. the way he destroyed those Chinese soldiers, except slower. His funeral had 12 attendees. A Veterans Administration study in 1961 found that Quad 50 gunners in Korea had a 78% rate of diagnosed psychological disorders post-war, higher than flamethrower operators at 71%. The reason, according to the psychiatrist's notes, was volume of killing in compressed time. The human brain can process killing one person. It struggles with killing dozens. When you kill hundreds, something breaks. The mechanism that allows you to see other humans as humans rather than targets, that mechanism fails. And sometimes it doesn't come back. The M2 Browning was doing what it was designed to do. It was winning engagements, stopping enemy advances, saving American lives. It just wasn't saving the men who fired it. Not all of them, not the parts of them that you couldn't see. But Korea was where another kind of M2 innovation emerged. Not the industrial scale killing of the quad mount. Something different. Something that would hint at the gun's ultimate potential. Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock was 19 years old when the Korean War ended. He'd missed it. Enlisted in the Marines in 1959, and at 17 spent his early years qualifying expert on the rifle range, year after year, and by 1966 had developed a reputation as the best shot in his unit. He deployed to Vietnam with a simple idea that would change the nature of long-range combat. What if you could turn the M2 Browning into a precision instrument? Hathcock had grown up in Arkansas hunting to put food on the table. He understood wind, he understood ballistics, he understood patience. His father had taught him to shoot by making him hold a rifle on target for an hour without moving. Build the muscles, control the breathing, become the rifle. The standard Marine sniper rifle in 1966 was the M40, a bolt-action weapon firing the 7.62 NATO round effective to about 800 yards. Past that, the bullet drop became too extreme, the wind drift too unpredictable. But the 50B MG was different. Heavier bullet, higher velocity, less affected by wind. The round could reach out past 2,000 yards and still have enough energy to kill. The problem was that the M2 was a machine gun designed for volume of fire, not precision. The trigger pull was heavy. The sights were crude. The whole system was built around putting as many rounds down range as possible, not putting one round exactly where you wanted it. Hathcock looked at this problem with the mind of a hunter who'd spent his childhood making every shot count because every missed shot meant his family went hungry. He went to the Navy Seabees, the construction battalion, and asked them to fabricate a mounting bracket, something that would hold an 8-power inertial scope on an M2. They welded it up for him out of scrap metal. No authorization, no formal request, just a sergeant with an idea and some CBs with welding equipment. Hathcock mounted the M2 on a tripod, added the scope, zeroed it at 1,000 yards, and went looking for targets. In 1967, somewhere in the hills near Duc Pho, he found one. An NVA officer, North Vietnamese Army, high-ranking based on the way the other soldiers deferred to him. The man was 2,500 yards away, nearly 1.5 miles, standing by a bicycle loaded with supplies, brushing his teeth by a stream. Hathcock did the math. At 2,500 yards, the bullet would drop approximately 38 feet. The travel time would be roughly 3 seconds. A light wind was blowing left to right. He adjusted for windage, adjusted for elevation, controlled his breathing. The officer stood up from the stream, stretching, exposed, vulnerable. Hathcock squeezed the trigger. 3 seconds. The officer continued stretching, unaware. Then the 50 caliber round arrived, traveling at approximately 1,200 feet per second, even after losing velocity over the distance. Still carrying over 1,200 foot-pounds of energy, more than a .44 Magnum at point-blank range. The round hit center mass. The officer dropped, dead before his body hit the ground. The soldiers around him scattered, confused, terrified. They'd heard no shot. The sound had taken nearly 4 seconds to reach them, and by then their officer was already dead. They had no idea where the shot had come from. No idea it was even possible to shoot someone from that distance. Hathcock had just set a record that would stand for 35 years. The longest confirmed sniper kill in history, with a machine gun modified with a scope bracket made from scrap metal. He would go on to make 92 more confirmed kills, estimated 300 total, each one at ranges that made conventional sniper rifles irrelevant. But there was a difference between what Hathcock did and what Speakman did. a difference that would haunt Hathcock for the rest of his life. Speakman killed 300 men in 6 hours, impersonal, industrial. The faces in the muzzle flash blurred together into a mass of targets. Dissociation was survival. Hathcock killed 93 men over the course of a year, personal, intimate. He saw each face through the scope. He watched each man for minutes, sometimes hours before taking the shot. He remembered each one. In an interview in 1988, 20 years after Vietnam, Hathcock said something that cuts to the heart of what the 50 caliber machine gun could do to the men who used it. People ask which was harder, the shot at 2,500 yards or the 300-yard shots where I could see their eyes. The long shots were technically harder, but the close ones, those are the ones I still see at night. With the 50, distance didn't matter. I could reach out and touch someone from half a mile away. That's godlike power, but gods don't have nightmares. Hathcock died in 1999 from multiple sclerosis. He was 56 years old. 2 weeks before he died, a reporter asked him if he had any regrets. "I regret that war made it necessary," Hathcock said. "I don't regret protecting my Marines. Every man I killed was trying to kill Marines, good Marines, kids really. 18, 19 years old. If I didn't kill that NVA sniper, he'd kill 3, 4, maybe 10 of our boys. So no, I don't regret protecting my brothers. But I regret that the world made it necessary." He paused, breathing through the oxygen mask that he needed by then. The gun is just a tool. The hard part isn't pulling the trigger, it's living with it after. While Hathcock was revolutionizing long-range combat with his scope-mounted M2, another kind of innovation was happening in the Mekong Delta. The Patrol Boat River, designated PBR, was a 31-foot fiberglass vessel designed to interdict Viet Cong supply operations on the thousands of miles of waterways that crisscross South Vietnam. 4-man crew. Armed with twin 50 caliber M2s in a forward turret, a single M2 at the stern, and an M60 machine gun. Fiberglass hull. No armor except thin gun shields around the weapon positions. Top speed 28 knots. The boats could move fast, maneuver in shallow water, and deliver devastating firepower. They were also death traps. Seaman James Williams was 19 years old from Detroit when he arrived in Vietnam in early 1968. He joined the Navy to avoid the draft, thinking that being on a boat was safer than humping through the jungle with the Army or Marines. He was assigned to River Division 531 as a forward gunner on a PBR Mark II. His first patrol was February 14, 1968, Valentine's Day. He thought it was funny at the time. The Mekong Delta is a maze. Rivers splitting into smaller rivers, canals connecting to streams, waterways ranging from 50 feet wide to 200. The perfect environment for ambush. The Viet Cong would build bunkers on both riverbanks, wait for a PBR to reach the middle of the channel, where it couldn't maneuver, then open up with crossfire. Williams's first ambush happened at 8:47 in the morning. Routine patrol Song Ong Dak River. The crew was relaxed, expecting a quiet morning. Williams was loading ammunition belts, smoking a cigarette. The RPG launched from the tree line on the right bank, missed the PBR by 6 feet, exploded in the water, and the shockwave felt like being inside a bell when someone hits it with a hammer. Simultaneous AK-47 and RPD machine gun fire from both banks. The distinct crack of supersonic rounds passing overhead, the splash of rounds hitting water, the metallic ping of rounds hitting the fiberglass hull. Williams didn't think. Training took over. Traverse right, acquire target, hold trigger. The twin M2s opened up, 1,100 rounds per minute combined. The noise was incredible. In the enclosed space of the river channel with banks on both sides, the sound had nowhere to go. It just built and built a physical pressure against your eardrums. Williams couldn't see individual targets, just muzzle flashes in the tree line. He aimed at the flashes and held the trigger. The tracers arced across the water, every fifth round visible as a streak of red slamming into the vegetation on the right bank. The boat captain pushed the throttle to full, 28 knots, running an S pattern to avoid RPGs, the boat heeling over hard with each turn. The engineman in the exposed position at the stern took an AK round through the shoulder, but kept the engine running. 7 minutes. 2,000 rounds expended from the M2s and M60 combined. The tree line on fire from tracer ignitions. Estimated 8 to 12 Viet Cong casualties. When they cleared the kill zone and the shooting stopped, Williams realized his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. The boat captain, a 20-year-old from California, asked if it was his first time. "Yes, sir. You did good. Tomorrow we do it again." River Division 531 operated 10 PBRs over a 40-day period from February to March. 1968, those boats were involved in 27 major contacts. 7 boats were hit by rockets. 4 boats were sunk or disabled. The casualty rate was 6% per month. Do the math on that. If sustained over a full year, that's a 72% casualty rate. 3 out of 4 sailors could expect to get hit. Williams's boat took an RPG on March 17th. Direct hit. The boat captain and rear gunner were killed instantly. Williams survived with severe burns, was evacuated to Japan, then back to the United States. He never returned to Vietnam. In 2003, researching his unit's history for a reunion, Williams discovered something in declassified after-action reports. The ambush on February 14th, the one where they'd claimed 8 to 12 enemy killed, had been cross-referenced with Viet Cong records captured in 1975. Actual enemy casualties, 3 killed, 7 wounded. "We thought we won that fight," Williams said. "We barely survived it." The M2 had thrown 2,000 rounds into that tree line. The PBR crew had felt invincible behind all that firepower. But they'd been shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, and the Viet Cong had been shooting at a 31-foot boat on a narrow river with nowhere to hide. Firepower versus exposure. The eternal equation. While the Navy was learning these lessons on the water, Army truck drivers were learning them on the roads. September 2nd, 1967. Route 19 and K Pass. A convoy of 30 trucks carrying the supplies from Quy Nhon to Pleiku. The NVA, North Vietnamese Army, hit them with an estimated regiment, 600 men. The ambush lasted 10 minutes. All 30 trucks destroyed, 21 drivers killed. The Transportation Corps soldiers who survived that massacre made a decision. Nobody was protecting them, so they'd protect themselves. Specialist Michael Barnett was 20 years old from Texas. He'd been a welder before the Army. He looked at his 5-ton M54 cargo truck and started doing math. Steel plates from damaged vehicles, sandbags for spall protection, an M250 caliber machine gun scrounged from an abandoned firebase, M60 machine guns traded for cigarettes and whiskey. He built the first gun truck in September 1967, called it Eve of Destruction. Welded 1/4-inch steel plates to the cargo bed, layered sandbags behind them. Mounted an M2 in front and another in back, added 2 M60s on the sides. 5-man crew driver plus 4 gunners. The official status of this vehicle was illegal. Unauthorized modification of military equipment. But when Barnett's company commander came to inspect it, he just looked at it for a long moment and then said, "I don't see any gun truck. I see a supply truck with extra equipment." The first combat test came on November 24th. Convoy escort Route 1. Viet Cong company ambushed from a tree line on the left side. Eve of Destruction engaged with all weapons. Barnett, manning the front M2, put 400 rounds into that tree line in 45 seconds. Trees fell down. The ambush collapsed. The convoy took 0 casualties. After the action, the company commander officially didn't notice what had happened. Unofficially, he said, "Build more." By 1969, over 100 gun trucks were operating across Vietnam. Names painted on the armor: King Kong, the Proud American, the Assassin War Wagon. Some mounted M45 Quad 50s, scrounged from World War II surplus. None of them were officially authorized. The Army never acknowledged they existed. But the truck drivers knew. Every convoy that made it through without casualties, they knew. Barnett's log entry from May 3, 1969, escorted my 73rd convoy today. Every truck made it. 0 casualties. The brass still won't officially acknowledge we exist. Fine, the drivers know. That's all that matters. The 50 cal saves lives, but only if you're behind it, not in front of it. We learned that the hard way on Route 19. 3 different wars, 3 different applications of the M2 Browning, Korea with the quad mount and industrial scale killing, Vietnam with Hathcock's precision shooting, and the PBR river patrols and unauthorized gun trucks. The gun was proving itself again and again. Versatile, reliable, devastating. But the cost kept mounting. Not just in enemy casualties. in the men who fired it. Speakman with his dissociation and alcoholism. Hathcock with his nightmares about godlike power. Williams with his burns and his realization that firepower didn't equal invincibility. The PBR sailors with their 72% casualty rate. The gun truck crews who had to build their own armor because nobody else would. The M2 was 50 years old by Vietnam, still essentially unchanged from the 1933 design, still firing the same cartridge John Moses Browning had developed in 1918, still putting out 13,000 foot-pounds of energy per round, and still, after 5 decades, offering no protection whatsoever to the men behind it. The gun was perfect. The gunners were expendable. That was the equation. That had always been the equation. And it would take another 35 years, another war, and one more generation of sacrifice before anyone seriously tried to change it. The Humvee was never supposed to be a combat vehicle. High-mobility, multi-purpose, wheeled vehicle. Designed in 1979 as a cargo and transport platform. Thin aluminum doors, canvas roof, armor protection sufficient to stop a 9mm pistol round. Maybe. But by 2003, when American forces rolled into Iraq, the Humvee had become the primary frontline vehicle for convoy operations, patrols, and urban combat, and the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, now 85 years old, was mounted on a turret ring in the roof. To use it, someone had to stand up through the hatch, shoulders, head, and torso completely exposed, a stationary target for anyone with a rifle, an RPG, or a grenade. History was repeating itself. Different war, different vehicle, same fundamental mistake. Corporal Sarah Martinez was 21 years old from California when she crossed into Iraq from Kuwait in March 2003 as part of the 1st Marine Division. She was an M2 gunner on a Humvee, and on March 23rd in the city of Nasiriyah, she learned exactly what it meant to be the most exposed person in a combat zone. The ambush came at 6:40 in the morning. Urban environment. Iraqi Fedayeen fighters with RPGs and AK-47s firing from rooftops. Martinez was standing in the turret scanning for threats when the first RPG streaked past 6 inches from her head. She heard the crack of it passing. Supersonic. Felt the displacement of air against her face. If she'd been 6 inches to the left, the shaped charge would have taken her head off. She traversed the M2, acquired the rooftop position, fired. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the brick parapet like it was cardboard. The fighter disappeared. But there were more. Always more. AK rounds hitting the Humvee body, the thin aluminum doing nothing to stop them. One round passed so close to Martinez's ear that she felt the heat of it. The supersonic crack so loud it left her deaf on that side for 3 days. 7 minutes of sustained contact. The Humvee driver executing evasive maneuvers through narrow streets. Martinez firing at targets that appeared and disappeared in windows on rooftops and alleyways. The M2 working perfectly. Reliable. Devastating. Exactly as designed. But Martinez was completely exposed. Standing in the open. A perfect target. And she knew it. Felt it. Every second she spent in that turret was a second someone could put a bullet in her. Statistics from Iraq 2003 to 2005 tell the story. M2 gunners accounted for 14% of all combat casualties, despite being a much smaller percentage of total personnel. Among Humvee crews specifically, 68% of casualties were gunners, the most exposed position, the most targeted position. Primary causes: small arms fire, 40%, RPG 35%, improvised explosive devices, 25%. The IEDs were the worst. The insurgents adapted quickly, figured out that the gunner caught the full blast of shrapnel that the thin Humvee armor couldn't stop. Roadside bombs packed with ball bearings, nailed scrap metal, detonated by cell phone or command wire when the Humvee was in the kill zone. The explosion would gut the vehicle, but the gunner standing up through the roof took the worst of it. On April 4, 2003, near Baghdad International Airport, Staff Sergeant Paul Ray Smith demonstrated both the ultimate potential and the ultimate cost of the M2 Browning machine gun. Smith was 33 years old from Tampa, Florida. He had a wife and 2 children. He was a combat engineer, B Company, 11th Engineer Battalion. His job that morning was supervising the construction of a holding area for Iraqi prisoners of war. The location was a courtyard near an aid station where over 100 wounded American soldiers were being treated. At 11:30, the situation deteriorated. An Iraqi Republican Guard company estimated at over 100 fighters attacked the position from multiple directions. They overwhelmed the defensive positions. An M113 armored personnel carrier took an RPG hit. The crew was wounded. The courtyard was about to be overrun. The aid station full of wounded Americans who couldn't defend themselves was about to be slaughtered. Smith made a decision. He ran to the disabled M113, climbed onto it, and took control of the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on top. The M113 was immobile, hit, smoking. Smith was standing on top of it, completely exposed with no cover whatsoever. The M2 was mounted on a pintle with a simple circular gun shield, but it only protected your chest. Your head, your arms, everything else was vulnerable. Smith opened fire. 300 rounds over approximately 30 minutes, engaging Iraqi forces attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. Traverse left fire, traverse right fire. Targets at 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The M2 cycling, perfectly ejecting brass that piled up around Smith's feet. Inside the aid station, the medics and wounded soldiers heard the 50 caliber machine gun firing nonstop. They knew someone was up there fighting for them. When the gun stopped, they thought they were dead. Then the counterattack arrived. 2 minutes after the M2 fell silent, American reinforcements reached the position. They found Smith slumped over the gun. An Iraqi sniper had shot him in the head, killed instantly. The aid station took 0 casualties. Over 100 lives saved. Smith's body was still warm when they pulled him off the gun. Before deploying to Iraq, Smith had written a letter to his parents. They found it in his personal effects after he died. There are 2 ways to come home from war: stepping off the plane or being carried off the plane. It doesn't matter how I come home because I am prepared to give all that I am to ensure that all my boys make it home. Smith became the first Medal of Honor recipient of the Iraq War. The medal was awarded posthumously in 2008, 5 years after his death. His children were 11 and 14 when they received it. The weapon that killed Paul Ray Smith was a standard 7.62 by 39 millimeter round fired from an AK-47. Cost approximately 30 cents. Muzzle energy around 1,500 foot-pounds. A gun shield heavy enough to stop rifle rounds would have cost around $800. The Pentagon had decided in 2003 that gun shields were not standard issue, too expensive for mass production. $800, 30 cents. The arithmetic of war. Smith had fired roughly 300 rounds. At 50 BMG production cost of approximately $3 per round, he'd expended $900 worth of ammunition, enough to buy a gun shield. But the gun shield wasn't there. So Smith died. He wasn't the last. The insurgency in Iraq evolved. By 2004, improvised explosive devices had become the primary weapon. The tactics became more sophisticated. The IEDs became more deadly. Sergeant Marcus Williams, 24 years old from Georgia, was an M2 gunner with the 3rd Infantry Division in Baghdad. Route Irish, the road from the airport to the Green Zone, was the deadliest stretch of pavement in Iraq. IED attacks happened daily, sometimes multiple times per day. August 15, 2005. Williams was on convoy duty. Standard patrol, 4 Humvees. At 14:45, the lead vehicle hit an IED. 3 155 millimeter artillery shells buried in the roadside command detonated by cell phone. The explosion occurred 20 feet from Williams's Humvee. The blast wave hit with over 200 psi of pressure. Williams, standing in the turret, caught the full force of it. The shrapnel from 3 artillery shells, converted into projectiles by high explosive, traveled outward at supersonic velocity. Ball bearings, nails, chunks of the shells themselves. Williams's body armor protected his torso. Everything else was unprotected. His right leg was amputated below the knee. His left arm took severe shrapnel damage, facial burns, traumatic brain injury, permanent hearing loss. The medical report was clinical. Blast force estimated 200 plus psi. Patient survived due to body armor torso protection. Extremities unprotected, catastrophic damage. Key finding: if gunner had been inside, vehicle injuries would be minimal. Inside the vehicle, not standing up through the turret, inside. From 2004 to 2006, there were over 10,000 IED attacks in Iraq. M2 gunner casualties from IEDs, over 800 wounded, over 200 killed. Survival rate for gunners compared to crew inside the vehicle, 40% versus 85%. The data was clear. The solution was obvious. Get the gunners inside. But in 2006, most Humvees still had exposed turrets. Still had young men and women standing up through roof hatches behind 50 caliber machine guns with no protection except a thin gun shield that didn't cover their heads or arms. The technology to change this already existed. It had existed since 2004, but procurement and deployment were slow. Bureaucracy ground forward at bureaucratic speed, and while it ground forward, people kept dying. On December 4, 2006, in the Adhamia district of Baghdad, a 19-year-old private first class named Ross Andrew McGinnis was standing in a Humvee turret when an insurgent on a rooftop threw a grenade. McGinnis was from Pennsylvania. He'd been born on June 14, 1987. He'd enlisted in 2004 at 17, needing parental consent. He deployed to Iraq in October 2006 with C Company 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment. He was the M2 gunner. The patrol was routine. 4-vehicle convoy, residential area, moderate threat level. McGinnis was scanning rooftops, hands on the 50 cal alert, but not alarmed. It was 14:38 hours. Clear day. 68 degrees. The grenade came from above. An RGD-5 fragmentation grenade. Soviet design. The insurgent threw it directly at the Humvee turret. McGinnis saw it, shouted the warning. A grenade. The grenade bounced off his chest and fell into the turret landing inside the Humvee among the 4 soldiers seated below. McGinnis had maybe 4 seconds. In second 1, the grenade was bouncing off his body armor, tumbling down into the crew compartment. He could see it falling, could see exactly where it was going to land. In second 2, his training told him what to do. Jump out, bail from the turret. He was standing up exposed. He could throw himself clear of the vehicle. Survival chance 90% or better. Standard procedure. What he was trained to do. In second 3, he realized that if he bailed out, the 4 soldiers inside the Humvee were going to die. Sergeant First Class Cedric Thomas. Specialist Sean Lawson. Private First Class Ryan Hill. Specialist Jonathan Gifford. His squad, his brothers, his responsibility. In second 4, Ross McGinnis made his choice. He threw himself down into the turret, onto the grenade, covered it with his body, absorbed the blast with his chest and abdomen and the armor plate he was wearing, knowing exactly what was going to happen, choosing it anyway. At 14:38 and 4 seconds, the grenade detonated. Inside the Humvee, the 4 soldiers felt the concussion, ears ringing, stunned but alive. Sergeant Thomas had minor shrapnel wounds to his right arm. Lawson had a concussion and tinnitus. Hill had superficial wounds. Gifford was uninjured. Outside the Humvee, other soldiers were already moving, responding to the explosion weapons up, scanning for threats. It took them several seconds to realize what had happened. McGinnis was dead. The medical examiner's report was precise and terrible. Catastrophic fragmentation injuries to chest, abdomen, and head. Death instantaneous. Blast pattern indicated body fully covered the grenade. Estimate absorbed 90% or more of fragmentation that would otherwise have killed or critically injured all 4 occupants. They found a letter in McGinnis's footlocker. He'd written it before deploying but never sent it. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Don't be sad. I knew what I signed up for. You always asked why I wanted to be a gunner. It's the most dangerous job, you said. I know, but here's the thing. The gunner protects everyone else. The guys inside the Humvee, they trust me to watch their backs. I can't let them down. If something happens, just know I did my job. I protected my boys. That's all that matters. Love, Ross. P.S. Tell Dad I finally found something I'm good at. McGinnis was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 2008. His mother received it from President Bush. She said Ross was just a kid. He should be here. But he chose to save his friends. I'm proud, and I'm heartbroken. Ross McGinnis died on December 4, 2006. He was 19 years old. He'd been in Iraq for 2 months. The Common Remotely Operated Weapon Station. Crows had been deployed to Iraq in late 2004, 2 years before McGinnis died. Crows mounted the M2 Browning on top of an armored vehicle, but the gunner didn't stand in a turret. The gunner sat inside the vehicle, protected by armor, and controlled the weapon with a joystick and a video screen. Daylight camera with 30-power zoom. Thermal imaging for night operations. Laser rangefinder accurate to 3,000 meters. Ballistic computer that automatically calculated bullet drop and wind drift. Accuracy 95% or better on first-round hits, even against moving targets. The critical difference: the gunner was inside, protected, safe. The system weighed 350 pounds with the M2 mounted. It cost approximately $260,000 per unit. The Pentagon had approved emergency funding for Crow's deployment in late 2004 in response to mounting casualties. By 2013, over 8,000 Crow systems were in service across all branches of the military. But in December 2006, McGinnis's Humvee didn't have Crows. It had a standard exposed turret, the same basic design that had been used since World War II. The same design that left the gunner standing in the open, vulnerable to everything. 2 months. If McGinnis's unit had received Crows 2 months earlier, he would have been sitting inside the vehicle when that grenade came down. The grenade would have bounced off the armored turret and fallen outside. McGinnis would have engaged the insurgent with the remote weapon system. 4 men would have been saved, and McGinnis would have survived. 2 months. That's what his life was worth. 2 months of procurement and deployment bureaucracy. In 2023, a former soldier testified anonymously in a therapy session recorded with his permission for a Veterans Affairs study on PTSD. He'd been an M2 gunner in Iraq from 2005 to 2006. Martinez died in June 2006, he said. Our unit got Crows in August 2006. 2 months. That's what his life was worth. 2 months of bureaucracy. The statistics from Crow's deployment are definitive. Before Crows, exposed turret gunners had a 14% casualty rate. With Crows, the casualty rate dropped to 2%, an 85% reduction. If you apply that 85% reduction retrospectively to the entire history of the M2 Browning from 1918 to 2004, the math is simple and devastating. Estimated American M2 gunner casualties across all conflicts: 41,580 killed in action. 85% of that number, 35,343. 35,000 lives. Conservative estimate. Could have been saved if Crows or any equivalent protective system had been developed and deployed earlier. John Moses Browning died in 1926. He was 71 years old. He died at his workbench in Belgium, still designing firearms, never knowing that his .50 caliber machine gun would become the most enduring weapon design in military history. He also never knew that it would take 86 years to protect the men using it. In his personal notes archived at Rock Island Arsenal, Browning wrote, "A gun is only as good as the man behind it. The finest mechanism in the world is useless if the operator is dead." Browning understood this. The man who designed more successful weapons than anyone in history understood that the weapon was only half the equation. The other half was the soldier. But the military organizations that bought his weapons, that deployed them, that built doctrine around them, somehow missed this fundamental truth for nearly a century. Why did it take so long? The answer is cost. It's always cost, but not the kind of cost you'd think. A Crow system costs $260,000. That sounds expensive, but a modern Humvee costs around $220,000. An MRAP mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle costs around $500,000. An M1 Abrams tank costs around $9 million. In the context of military procurement, $260,000 is not expensive. It's cheap, cheaper than replacing a trained soldier, vastly cheaper than the lifetime medical costs for a soldier wounded by an IED or a sniper round. The real cost wasn't financial. The real cost was doctrinal inertia, the resistance to change, the institutional belief that this is how we've always done it, so this is how we'll keep doing it. In 1941, when Alan Cooper's Memphis Belle II was being built, enclosed turret designs existed, engineering drawings, prototype systems that would have protected the ball turret gunner. The military reviewed those designs and decided not to use them. 3 weeks of production delay was deemed unacceptable. In 2003, when Paul Ray Smith deployed to Iraq, gun shields heavy enough to stop rifle rounds existed. They cost about $800. The military decided they were not standard issue, too expensive for mass production. In 2006, when Ross McGinnis died covering a grenade, Crows had been in the procurement pipeline for 2 years, deployed to some units, not to his. The system was rolling out, but slowly, because that's how procurement works. 3 weeks, $800. 2 months. These are the margins on which lives are measured. The M2 Browning machine gun has now served for 107 years. It is currently in active service in over 100 countries. It is still being manufactured. The most recent variant, the M2A1, introduced in 2010, features a quick-change barrel system and a manual safety. Otherwise, it is mechanically identical to the M2HB that emerged in 1933. 107 years, virtually unchanged. Still firing the same cartridge John Moses Browning developed in 1918. Still delivering 13,000 foot-pounds of energy per round. Still capable of penetrating armor-destroying vehicles, killing at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Serial number 324, manufactured in 1921, was finally retired from service in 2015. 94 years of service. That one gun outlived 4 or 5 generations of soldiers. The gun is immortal. The gunners are not. Today, with Crow's integration at approximately 85% of United States military vehicle-mounted weapon systems, American soldiers operating the M2 finally have the protection that should have been standard from the beginning. But the protection came 86 years late, and 41,580 gunners didn't live to see it. In 2018, Alan Cooper gave his final interview. He was 95 years old. Most of his crew was long dead. Harrison Mitchell, all of them. The interviewer asked him what he wanted people to remember. Remember the gun, sure. It's a masterpiece of engineering. But remember the boys more. Remember that for every M2 in a museum, there were thousands of kids who stood behind it with no armor, no protection. Remember that we solved the engineering problem in 15 years, but it took 86 years to solve the human problem. Remember that wars are won by guns, but fought by people. And people die. He paused, looking at a photograph of his World War II crew. 10 young men in leather jackets standing in front of a B-17, squinting into the sun. None older than 25. I'm 95 years old. I've lived 73 years longer than my pilot, my bombardier, my waist gunners. The gun that should have died in 1950 is still fighting in 2018. The boys who should have lived to 2018 died in 1944. Another pause. Longer this time. That's not progress. That's tragedy. Cooper died in 2019. He was buried with full military honors. His obituary listed him as one of the last surviving ball turret gunners from World War II. At the National Cemetery on a cold day in 2025, a young Army private stands at Ross McGinnis's grave. The private is 19 years old, the same age McGinnis was when he died. He's an M2 gunner trained on Crows, the remote weapon system that keeps him safe inside his vehicle. He places an American flag at the headstone, salutes, stands there in silence thinking about a kid he never met who died 2 months before the technology existed that could have saved him. The private is alive because McGinnis died. The private is safe because McGinnis wasn't. The private has a choice because McGinnis didn't. That's the legacy. That's what 41,580 gunners bought with their lives. The realization, purchased in blood over nearly a century, that the gun and the gunner are not separate problems. They never were. The technology exists now. Crows, remote weapon stations, armored turrets. Systems that allow a soldier to operate the most powerful machine gun in history from a position of safety rather than exposure. But these systems didn't arrive because of enlightened thinking or proactive planning. They arrived because enough people died that the institutional inertia finally broke. Because the statistics became undeniable. Because families asked why their sons and daughters were standing exposed in combat zones in the 21st century, using the same basic tactical approach as soldiers in 1944. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun will continue to serve. It will probably still be in service in 2050, in 2075, maybe in 2010. The design is that good, the weapon is that effective. But now finally, after 107 years, the soldiers using it have the protection they should have had from the beginning, 35,000 lives. That's the conservative estimate of what that protection could have saved. 35,000 Alan Coopers, who might have lived to 95. 35,000 Ross McGinnises who might have come home to their families. Instead, we have 41,580 names, graves, Gold Star families, memories of sons and daughters and brothers and sisters who stood behind the most powerful machine gun in history and paid with their lives for the privilege. This is their story. The story of the gun that ate its gunners. The story of a weapon so perfect that for nearly a century we forgot about the people who had to use it. John Moses Browning built a masterpiece. The M2 is everything a weapon should be. Reliable, powerful, enduring. But a weapon without a soldier to fire it is just metal and springs. And a soldier without protection is just a casualty waiting to happen. It took us 86 years to learn that lesson. 41,580 lives to learn it. The gun is still here, still serving, still perfect. The gunners are finally safe. That should have been the goal from the beginning, but it took a century of sacrifice to get there. Remember the gun, but remember the boys more.